is Walt Heyer. I'm a former female identifying transgender. That was over 30 years ago. I started my journey to this reckless and crazy world of transgenderism at the age of 4. When my grandmother was cross-dressing me, I became very interested in this idea about changing what you look like, your appearance. My grandmother was a dressmaker, and so I became very curious about the clothing that she was making for clients that she had when I was over at her house. And this led to her actually making me a purple chiffon, full-length purple chiffon evening dress when I was 4 years old. And here we are, 77 years later, and I'm still talking about the purple dress. So I think it's important, I mentioned this at the start, for anyone who thinks that putting a boy in a dress is benign and harmless, think again. Putting a boy in a dress is destructive. It's emotional and psychological abuse that oftentimes, unfortunately, leads to a lifetime of discomfort about who you are. Remember that young children are forming the idea of who they are, who they're going to be at a very young age. And anybody who steps in and begins to shape, form, influence that development is actually interfering with the natural process that oftentimes leads to tragedy on down the road. And that's what happened to me. And it's happened, quite frankly, to thousands of people. After wearing that purple dress that Grandma made me, and she used to just fawn over how cute I looked, how wonderful I was. And she never did that when I wore little cowboy boots and my tore up jeans. I was a scruffy, dirty little kid. Back in those days, people didn't have grass or fences. I was just a dirty little kid in the back alley of a home in Los Angeles, California. But what that led to was this secret that we started, Grandma and I, about her making that dress. My parents never knew. And this went on for about 2.5 years until I became so, I'll use the word advisingly, sort of addicted to the affirmation of her telling me how cute and wonderful I looked, because it was so different than what she would say to me when I was a little boy. I was usually being scolded or something was happening. So there was an obvious difference when I was dressed up as a girl, how I was treated and how I was treated as a boy. And that should be instructive to us who are listening to this today. And so once I got so interested in this cross-dressing, I took the purple dress home secretly because, as I said, my parents didn't know. I put it in a brown paper bag and took it home because I wanted to feel those same feelings that I was having at Grandma's house at home, because I didn't have those same feelings at home. Well, my mom found the dress in the brown paper bag in my drawer of my dresser. And she asked me who made it because she didn't know. And so I told my mom, I said, well, Grandma made it. And then my dad heard that, and my mom and dad started fighting over this whole thing about me wearing a dress. So at that point, the secret that Grandma had and that I had just blown up. And I realized as a young boy, now at about 6 years old, that I was causing my parents to fight because of this dress that I'd been wearing that my grandma had made me. And I think we need to understand the implications of this. You know, a young child doesn't know anything about when somebody's keeping a secret, the fact that there might be something wrong if we're withholding information from the parents. And so this fight ensued with my mom and dad. And I was never allowed to go back to my grandma's house without my mom and dad being with me. And I never saw the purple dress again. It evaporated. Obviously, my dad threw it away. But keep in mind now, we're talking in the middle 1940s, probably 1946, maybe 1947. There's no information about these words that we use today, transgenderism and transitioning and gender, whatever that people want to call it. I was just a boy that had been put in a dress by his grandmother and affirmed and told how cute I was, and who became accustomed to putting that dress on and feeling different about who I was, to the point to where I actually would go to sleep at night thinking that there was something wrong with me, and that probably I was born wrong and I would have been better had I been born a girl. So and looking back now, the 77 years, I realized the purple dress planted in my head the second she put that dress on me and started affirming that there was something wrong with Walt. There must be something wrong with him because he needs something else. He's just not good the way he is. And I think as clinicians and people who work with people, we need to understand the harm done. How different would it have been had my grandma told me how cute I was as a little boy, or scruffy little boy that I was, or how handsome I was, or how strong I was, or whatever. That never took place. So by 1946, 47, with my parents now knowing about this purple dress, my dad didn't know what to do. He was an auxiliary police officer, and his idea, and of course he was very upset, but his idea was to shape me into the man that he wanted me to be. And he decided that he was going to do that with a hardwood floor plank by disciplining me whenever I did anything wrong. And believe me, I did a lot of things wrong. And so that hardwood floor plank found its way on my tender little butt many, many times, to the point where Dad would raise welts on me. I would be screaming in pain. And I'm sure much of his swinging of that hardwood floor plank on my butt was his frustration at what my grandmother had done by putting me in a purple dress. Because now that purple dress was now affecting him. It was affecting his behavior, not just my behavior, but it was also affecting the behavior between my mom and dad. And we need to realize how that one dress put on a boy is beginning to change the whole attitude and the whole structure within the family. And it really wasn't healthy. And then my dad's adopted brother, Uncle Fred, probably a year or two later, I was probably 7 or 8 years old, when he learned that I'd been wearing a purple dress. And Fred was not what I would call an upstanding citizen. He drank a little bit too much, even as a teenager. And he took me up behind the house one day and began to molest me. Why was he doing that? He was molesting me because of the purple dress. He thought I was fair game to be molested because I had been wearing a purple dress. We should take note of this. That purple dress not only caused me to think there was something wrong with me, it also caused my father to not know what to do with me and hit me with a hardwood floor plank. But my uncle stepped in because of that purple dress and began to sexually molest me. If we take the purple dress out of my life, nothing happens. I'm able to grow up just a little boy in cowboy boots with none of this happening. No hardwood floor plank, no sexual molestations. That purple dress was the trigger to why I'm talking to you today. The effects of that purple dress, quite frankly, never stopped. the impact of the sexual abuse, the physical abuse. And believe me, putting a boy in a dress is emotional and psychological abuse. It is not benign. And from the people that I work with, and I've worked with hundreds, probably thousands, every one of them would tell you the same thing. Nothing good comes from suggesting, encouraging, assisting, or nurturing a young boy to wear a purple dress and take on a different identity of his persona. But it was done. The impact was made. The imprint was made in my heart and my mind that there was something wrong with me. I was different. And so I would go to bed at night kind of wondering, should I have been made a girl? And I remember my parents were people of faith, and I would pray to God, take this away from me. All the way up until 16, 17 years old, it wouldn't go away. There was no therapist, there was no information, there was no internet. There was just me and the experience that I had with a purple dress, hardwood floor plank, and sexual molestation. What is a boy under 10 years of age to do with this information? He's going to suffer. That's what's going to happen. But in the 1950s, there was a big news report about Christine Jorgensen, a person in the military, a man in the military who became a woman. And that news article made me think, well, that's who I am. That must be who I am. You see, without any other information, I began to attach this history that I had to this idea that I should become like Christine Jorgensen. And it's all false information. There's nothing true about it. But who's going to tell me that it's false information and that the reason I feel this way is because of my early childhood? No one. I struggled with all these things through my teens. And here's the interesting part. I was never homosexual. I never had same-sex attraction or homosexual tendencies. And to be honest with you, I'll insert right here that 90% of the men that I work with are heterosexual men who had suffered some event in their life that caused them some issues about their identity, not their sexuality. I never engaged in homosexuality. I didn't understand homosexuality. I wasn't attracted to men at all. So going through this process early on, I was cross-dressing in my teens and in my early 20s, even after I was married. I married a gal from church. And by this time, I was working on the Apollo space missions as an associate design engineer in the area of cryogenics. You see, I'd studied at school and I became an associate design engineer at North American Aviation in California. I took that experience and worked several years in this engineering field, developing cryogenic connectors for the Apollo space missions. But I took that experience and moved to the auto industry and became, over a period of 15 years, the national operations manager for American Honda Motor Company. But you know what? That experience of the purple dress, the hardwood floor plank, and the sexual molestation, and the constant thinking in my head that there was something wrong with me, never left me. It played like a radio in my head that I couldn't turn off. Something wrong with you, Walt. You wouldn't be dressing as a girl if there wasn't something wrong with you. You have a wife, you have children, you have a job. Who do you go see to help you with these issues? Who's going to guide you out of the harm that had been caused? Who is going to be skilled and knowledgeable to deal with it? So who did I go to? I went to, at the time, a guy named Paul Walker. And by this time, I'm 38 years old. Dr. Paul Walker, Union Street office, had a shingle outside his office, PhD. He was proud to say that he was a person who dealt with, in fact, he authored the original Harry Benjamin International Standards of Care. He was the chairperson, along with some other doctors. That standards of care morphed into what we have today called WPATH. My therapist was the guy who developed those standards in their original form. My therapist also, meeting him at his office, diagnosed me with gender dysphoria. Now, you can see today, speaking to you, I never had gender dysphoria. I had a purple dress, a hardwood floor plank, and I was sexually abused. I realize today that that's not gender dysphoria. There was a crime of sexual abuse. There was the emotional trouble of being completely demoralized by the physical hardwood floor plank and the cross-dressing that my grandma did, destroyed the core identity of who I was. That's not gender dysphoria. That's abuse. But it took me a long time to realize that, many years, in fact. So with these meetings with Dr. Walker at his office in Union Street, he approved me for hormone therapy. I was able to get the hormones. He approved me for gender reassignment surgery. And I went to Trinidad, Colorado, and Dr. Stanley Biber in 1983 performed the surgery. From the time that I had my first meeting with Dr. Walker to the time I had the surgery was about 2 years. Meeting with Walker several times. I underwent the surgery. At this time, I was an executive for Honda. I went to them and told them in 1983 that I was going through this process. They terminated me, put all my things in a cardboard box, walked me to the guard gate, and I went out the door. That was October 25th, 1983. And to this date, I never had another job anywhere equal to that job. The diagnosis of gender dysphoria and the idea that undergoing hormone therapy and surgery destroyed my life. It destroyed my marriage. It destroyed my 2 children. I was homeless after a few months of leaving Honda, laying in the 2nd Street Park in Long Beach, California, in a pile of vomit, an alcoholic, broken beyond all recognition. I was wearing a rabbit fur coat, struggling to get off the ground, wondering, where do I go next? What had happened? Because of a purple dress, hardwood floor plank, and being sexually molested, and nobody around that knew what to do, including Dr. Walker, the supposed specialist, did not know what to do. He only abused me more with his diagnosis. I told him about the history, and he said it was irrelevant. The hell it is. It's a major factor. We need to understand that. We should never, ever overlook the underlying childhood developmental issues that cause people to not like who they are and cause them to think they should become someone they can never, ever be. So I identified as a female for 8 years. I did get out of that park eventually. And through the California Department of Rehabilitation and my sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous, which today I have 35 years, over 35 years of sobriety, I was able to get a job with the federal government at FDIC and the Postal Service. But for me, that was not enough. I was living as Laura at that time. And I started studying psychology at UC Santa Cruz because I thought I wanted to become a PhD and actually help people transition because I didn't at that time have the information that I have now. And in studying at UC Santa Cruz, I started cracking open the books and realized in the stories that I was reading that people actually, they've written stories about people having what they called these secondary disorders that were causing them to identify as a transgender. They were writing about it. I think the first book I read was that had the stories in it was from Cornell University. And it began to open my eyes. And by the time I'd finished my 2-year studies at UC Santa Cruz to become a counselor, I was working in different clinical environments as working as therapy for alcoholics and drug addicts. I worked in a California, down in Long Beach area, lockdown psych unit. And I was a chemical dependency tech working 12-hour shifts with the nurses on staff and working with a psychiatric doctor, which is where my life began to change. I learned a lot from that psychiatric doctor. Working with him, he said, well, Laura at the time, do you mind if I spend a little time with you? And he started spending time with me when we weren't dealing with the clients on the floor. And he says, he said, you may have some kind of dissociative disorder, but I'm not sure. I want you to go see, here's a list of 3 or 4 people that I would suggest you go see, because all they do is evaluate people and diagnose maybe issues that they have. So I went and saw a lady on Wilshire Boulevard, and I worked with her for like 6 weeks. And at the end of it, she said, you never should have had surgery. You probably ended up with having somewhat of and she told me how complicated dissociative disorders are, because she said you didn't have multiple personality. But she said this caused you to develop some fracturing in your identity, the abuse, the sexual abuse, the physical abuse. And I didn't believe her. So I went to like the other people on the list that the doctor gave me, and they all confirmed that those issues that I had caused me to have some very difficult times with my identity. This identifying as a person, frankly, you can never be. To this date, I realize now, after working with people over the last 12 years, and just keep in mind now, I have a website called sexchangeregret.com. And in the last 7 years, 7 years, 2 million people have come to look at my website. And you should too if you haven't. And during those 7 years, I've had over 10,000 emails come to my inbox, many of them asking for help or suggestions or guidance about how to detransition, or how to keep my child from transitioning, or what do I do about my husband who's cross-dressing and leaving the house at night and doesn't come back for a couple of days. Well, I've learned a lot from the people that I've worked with, the many, many people that come in every single day. And the funny part of it is the people who've gone through this and regret it are far more open to talking about what happened to them when they were a child than they are before, because they're a little afraid to tell you all the information up front, because they're fearful that you're going to say, no, you shouldn't because of these issues. Well, it's true. We should be saying no, frankly, in my view, to all of them who come to us with these issues, because they do have some comorbidities. Body dysmorphia, bipolar 1 disorder, schizophrenia, dissociative disorders. And the other one for the adult men who are married, who are leaving their wives and going out for the night, a large majority of them, it's autogynephilia or transvestic fetish. They're not going out to meet another person. They're going out to get dressed and look in the mirror and become sexually aroused by who they see in the mirror. That's who they're having an affair with, themselves in a dress. And they're also suffering from probably borderline personality disorder. To give these individuals who are suffering in these many different ways with these many different comorbidities is the greatest medical tragedy in my view. And I've spoken about this in my book, Paper Genders, and a cheap plug for my great book, Trans Life Survivors. These books are important for us to look at because what I see is the consequences of going through this process. And today, right today, I'm working with a young man in California who was diagnosed by a clinic with schizophrenia, bipolar 1 disorder, PTSD. He had been sexually abused, and they transitioned him. They cut his genitals off and told him, "You will be fine as a female." That was in March. He contacted me and said, "Walt, can you help me detransition?" I had a school teacher only a few months ago who went to a clinic and they told him he was gender dysphoric and that you need hormones and you need surgery. He did it. He contacted me and said, "How do I get out of this mess that I'm in?" I had a 62-year-old man just 2 days ago contact me, 62 years old, said he'd been struggling most of his life with his identity. No, he wasn't. He was struggling with autogynephilia, but they didn't tell him that. It was only after he went through the surgery and talked to me and looked at the word and looked it up, and we began to talk about those issues. He never needed the surgery either. I don't know anybody that needs it. I know they're doing it to people every single day. And I believe, as a helping person myself, that my job is to find out what caused the individual to dislike himself so much that he's willing to cut body parts off and re-identify who he is. And I'm here to tell you today that 100% of the people that I have had the opportunity to work directly with have been able to tell me precisely what it was and what happened that caused them to identify as a female when they knew that there was a secondary issue. Sexual abuse is certainly one of them. Abandonment is another one. I had a man in Palm Springs, California, who was in a family of 8 children. And when he contacted me, I said, "Why did you do this? What has caused you to do this?" And he said at first, "Well, I don't know." I said, "No, you know. You know, let's talk about it." And he couldn't tell me the first couple of times, but I kept digging in and saying, "Come on, let's explore this." And he said, "Well, frankly, no one in my family even knew I was there. I had all these siblings, and no one knew I was there. So I knew if I identified as a transgender and went and had breast surgery and started dressing up as a girl, they would know I was there." He wanted to be noticed. They diagnosed him with gender dysphoria because he wanted to be noticed. Now, is that insane? Is it just as insane to give someone hormones and surgery who is schizophrenic, bipolar, PTSD, and was sexually abused? Absolutely. It never should happen. The 62-year-old said, "Well, you know, the welfare worker I was working with says I can get you the hormones, and you know, you obviously have gender dysphoria." These are not clinical people. They're not helpful. People are going along for the ride. And I'll tell you, I've come to the conclusion from the people that I've worked with. Now, it may be out there. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, so don't spin off that way. From the people I work with, I have not found one that had gender dysphoria. I found every one of them to have something significant, but it wasn't gender dysphoria. Maybe they had where they didn't like who they were, like the young man who changed because he wasn't being noticed. But I take a great deal of time. I have worked with individuals for as long as 2 years, just going through the process and talking to them. And they spill their guts out to me. And we're able to kind of unwrap some of these things that are deep down in there. Some of them are very quick to tell me. I had a 45-year-old man who contacted me because he had regret. And I said, tell me about your childhood. He said, well, it wasn't remarkable. Nothing really happened. I said, let's talk about it. And at 11 years old, he was sexually abused by his diving coach at a summer camp. And I said, how soon after that event did you begin to doubt about who you were and want to become somebody else? And he paused quietly for a moment. He said, not long after that. You see, the clues are there. I can help people quicker by dismissing and ignoring the idea that they have gender dysphoria. When I started doing that, I was able to affect better conversations and go deeper, because the idea of gender dysphoria just sort of shuts the conversation off. It's not even a diagnosis. Gender dysphoria is a symptom of something deeper and more troubling and more sinister going on in their life. In my view, gender dysphoria is not and never has been a diagnosis. You know, I had gender dysphoria. I had Ford dysphoria when I bought a bum Ford, right? Because this dysphoria is just the opposite of euphoria. I don't feel good about myself. Well, that's a little bit soft. When we start cutting body parts off and filling ourselves with hormones and re-identifying who we are, that is self-destructive behavior. The fact of the matter is, the whole idea of identifying as transgender, when we boil it down and have an intellectual conversation about it, is self-destructive. You're destroying who you are. Is it not destructive to cut body parts off? Is it not destructive to take hormones? Is it not destroying who you are to give yourself a new identity? Something to think about, isn't it? So I'm grateful at nearly 81 years old to still be alive and well and working with people almost every day. I've worked with kids as young as 10 years old, who, by the way, detransitioned within 2 weeks of working with mom, who had been identifying as a boy for 2 or 3 years. I've worked with 13-year-old girls, 14 and 15-year-olds. And some of them, when I work with the mom, I don't work directly with the child, just talking to the mom and asking the mom to ask a few good questions. They detransition. The kids open up. Well, I'm just doing it because I was on the internet, or because my friends are doing it. Or one of the girls said, I did it because I had a bad dad, a girl who was in foster care. Her dad had sexually abused her, and she did not want to be who she was. She thought if she became a boy, that no one would touch her again. I know from working with some of the men who've been sexually molested, they too feel like if they cut their genitals off and identify as a female, they won't ever be sexually molested again, because they take away the appendage that became so attractive to someone that abused them. It's not about transgenderism. It's not about gender dysphoria. It's about self-preservation. It's about not wanting to be sexually abused again and identifying as a female for some guys, or a man for girls, oftentimes affords that opportunity. As clinicians and helpers, we need to go deeper and skip over this idea, in my view, about gender dysphoria. Because to this date, not one person in the history of mankind who was just dealing with these psychological and emotional issues has ever biologically changed from female to male or male to female. They have changed only one thing: their social persona. That's the only thing that we can change, their social persona. We don't change their genders. We're not helping them. We're destroying their life. And until such time as we realize that, there's going to be more and more people contacting my website. 2 million people in 7 years, 10,000 emails, not because I'm brilliant, but because we're doing harm to children and adults by not telling them that they have serious comorbidities and hormones and surgery not going to help them. Thank you for this time. I'm Walt Heyer.